This seminar was performed under the umbrella of Sapienza Neuroscience seminars, a series of seminars on neurosciences by Sapienza University of Rome. The talk today is to celebrate the World Alzheimer's Disease Day. You can see here my co-workers in the development of this presentation and clinical studies on Alzheimer's disease. We will talk about the dementia. Dementia is a clinical syndrome, a clinical manifestation in all the patients, but not only. But today we will talk about dementia in old patients. And the clinical manifestation, the syndrome, is characterized by difficulty with everyday tasks, so disabilities, severe disabilities, which needs a caregiver, a support, something helping you to worrying, to eating, to go outside the home, and so on. And at the basis of this disability in the activities of daily living, there are some cognitive disorders, severe cognitive disorders. People have severe visuospatial deficits or episodic memory deficits, or and also some abnormalities in vigilance and self-consciousness. Unfortunately, often you can see also some behavioral and the mood disorders in patients with dementia. Today, we will talk about one of the causes of dementia in old people, the Alzheimer's disease. The Alzheimer's disease was discovered by a physician, a German physician, Alois Alzheimer, in 1904. He was the first to link some brain plaques in autopsy with the clinical manifestations of a woman with mental disorders, cognitive and behavioral disorders. After several years, on September 21, 1994, International Alzheimer Association launched the first World Alzheimer's Day. And the aim of this celebration is make people aware of Alzheimer's disease impact on world health, and to explain what are the manifestations, the clinical manifestation of this disease, the amount of people in the world suffering from Alzheimer's disease, what's the state of art of the therapies and efforts of researchers in the battle with Alzheimer's disease. And today this talk is to share with you a specific angle of the scientific approach to this Alzheimer's disease. The approach based on brain rhythms and electroencephalographic techniques to study Alzheimer's disease. You can see in this slide that there are several manifestations of dementia in adults and old people. Alzheimer's disease is related to progressive diseases belonging to dementia, and specifically the so-called neurodegenerative diseases, which can be distinguished by cerebrovascular diseases due to alterations in the blood flow in the brain, or other conditions related to infections in the brain, for example. One of the most popular theory about the causes, the neurobiological causes of Alzheimer's disease, is the so-called amyloid tau cascade. According to a recent research guideline on the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, you can detect Alzheimer's disease patients measuring in vivo the two main neuropathological features of Alzheimer's disease, which are the accumulation of the protein amyloid in the brain and the detection of an abnormal increase of tau protein in the brain. And you can measure in vivo, not only during an autopsy, these features in the brains. And you can do it, for example, with the positron emission tomography, using antibodies binding amyloid in the brain and showing images where in which you can see typically in red the places in the brain with a high accumulation of amyloid. And the same is true with the positron emission tomography with antibodies binding tau protein in the brain. You can see here an example with red spots where you can find an abnormal accumulation of tau protein in the brain. But you can also measure indirectly in vivo amyloid and tau by means of the analysis of cerebrospinal fluid that you can obtain with the lumbar puncture in vivo. And you can analyze the amount of amyloid and tau in the cerebrospinal fluid. And over some thresholds, you can have a neurobiological diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, even when you don't have clinical manifestations. And then you can use other techniques to measure the loss of neurons in the brain. For example, the positron emission tomography using radioactive sugar linking to the neurons when they are active. When you have a decrease of this kind of neuronal activity in some places related to memory and higher functions in the brain, you can have signs of neurodegeneration related to cognitive deficits. This is very useful to follow the progression of the disease. And you can also use structural magnetic resonance imaging, in which you can measure the loss of volume in the gray matter of the cerebral cortex in some places. For example, you see here in blue the reduction in volume in Alzheimer's disease patients in some places of the temporal, parietal, and cortical regions, typical of the more frequent manifestation of Alzheimer's disease with memory deficits. And the recent guidelines of Jack and colleagues, 2018, of the National Institute of Aging and Alzheimer's Association, describe the use of these techniques for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, measuring in vivo amyloid and tau in the brain, and following the disease progression, measuring neurodegeneration. In this talk, we try to convince you that it's missing the neurophysiological part of Alzheimer's disease history. There is no reference to the brain electrical activity, which is one of the emerging features of the brain function. And indeed, you can record EEG signals, EEG oscillations in the brain in subjects while they are in the resting state, quiet vigilance in wakefulness. And you can see typical features of this kind of quiet vigilance. And you can see changes in the EEG when they have a transition to drowsiness and the light sleep or deep sleep. The first to describe the EEG activity in humans during resting state, quiet vigilance, was German psychiatrist Hans Berger. He was the first to record EEG from the scalp electrodes in 1924 and describe the features of this EEG activity and published these results in 1929. And in the papers, he predicted that this kind of abnormalities of EEG rhythms could characterize mental disorders in humans. He was a psychiatrist. In particular, he recorded EEG in a subject with eyes closed, quiet vigilance in wakefulness, and he could describe a dominant ample oscillations from 8 to 12, 13 cycles per second Hertz in the posterior areas. And you can see here these ample oscillations in a resting state, eyes closed, quiet vigilance. And he could demonstrate that if the subjects moved to mental operations, cognitive operations, there was the disappearance of alpha rhythms and the appearance of oscillations at higher frequencies, beta to gamma Hertz. And you can see here in the upper trace the disappearance of ample alpha rhythms and higher frequencies in the traces. And if you move to light sleep and deep sleep, you can see that the frequency and amplitude of EEG oscillations change. So EEG activity is sensitive to the vigilance level, from alertness to quiet vigilance, to light sleep, to deep sleep, and provides an angle to study the brain functions. And the Hans Berger's observations of resting state EEG were confirmed by the Nobel Prize Adrian. And he could replicate the Hans Berger experiments during EEG recordings at Howard Medical School. And you can see the original traces in the eyes closed, ample alpha oscillations, eyes open, more cortical activity, and disappearance of alpha rhythms. So what's the angle of EEG rhythms in the evaluation of the brain function in healthy subjects and Alzheimer's disease patients? It's the angle of cortical neural synchronization of activity. And you can see here in this slide the scalp in the cerebral cortex pyramidal neurons having the main dendrites parallel to the cortical surface. You see that they are aligned as a palisade. And so you can have the summation, the spatial summation of postsynaptic potentials when these neurons are active at the same time. So spatial summation and temporal synchronization of neural activity in these pyramidal cells. And when here you see 6 cortical pyramidal neurons, and you see a sketch with the postsynaptic potential in these 6 neurons. And you see that when you are not observing a synchronization, a time alignment of postsynaptic potentials, you see that you have no summation and a flat EEG activity in the scalp surface. But when you have a postsynaptic potential at the same time, at the same rhythm, there is a spatial summation, and you see ample oscillations of EEG activity in the brain. So at a given frequency. So this is an angle to study a specific feature of brain neuronal activity that you cannot observe with functional magnetic resonance imaging or positron emission tomography with the radioactive sugar. You cannot have this time resolution to measure cortical neurosynchronization, which is one emerging feature of brain activity and function. And another important contribution was produced by Dr. Lopez da Silva, which demonstrated with simultaneous recording of functional resting state magnetic resonance imaging, the bold signal, in red the maximum activity during resting state in some places of the brain in these maps, and you could relate the alpha rhythms in simultaneous resting state EEG recordings. And you can see that you could show that where there is a high bold activity in the resting state, there was low alpha recordings. And when he could observe low cortical activity in the fluctuation of the resting state cortical activity, he could record ample alpha rhythms. So he could demonstrate that the higher the alpha rhythm amplitude, the lower the cortical activation. Another important contribution to understand the neurophysiology underlying EEG was produced by Alexander Luria. He proposed a theory of the working brain in which the first unit of the working brain was focused on the regulation of vigilance and sleep-wake cycle. And this first unit was composed by reticular formation in the brainstem and some circuits based on acetylcholine and the basal forebrain and projection to the cerebral cortex and thalamus, and the thalamocortical interactions. Now we know that there are also dopaminergic nuclei in the brainstem projecting to the cerebral cortex and arousing the cerebral cortex and modulating alpha rhythms. And also other ascending projection using noradrenaline or orexin from hypothalamus. And so parallel ascending systems can interact with thalamocortical circuits and can modulate the cortical activation from alertness to quiet vigilance to light sleep and sleep. So the heuristic contribution of EEG techniques in Alzheimer's disease is based on the measurement of the ability of the brain circuits ascending neuromodulating system to modulate the cortical activation from wakefulness to sleep and different degrees of vigilance. This is something that you cannot measure with the neuropsychological tests of attention or focus attention or working memory, because when you ask people to process external stimuli to have some elaboration and outcome, you are probing attentional cortical systems or episodic memory systems, but not the circuits modulating vigilance. From the EEG traces recording time by time, you can derive some quantitative measures, the EEG biomarkers, the quantitative EEG biomarkers. And you have in this slide a demonstration that in this sketch of a simplified EEG signal here in the slide. You can see that in this case, we compose a simulation of EEG activity with 3 elementary oscillations at 1.5 Hertz, 8 Hertz, and 20 Hertz. But when you have this composition of 3 elementary oscillations, you have a EEG-like signal. And you can quantify the amplitude of elementary EEG oscillations with the EEG power spectrum. And you can see that when you have the highest amplitude in 8 Hertz in the spectrum, you have the maximum power of the alpha peak at 8 Hertz. When you have the lower amplitude in 20 Hertz in the spectrum, you have the lower power. And in this case, we have an intermediate amplitude in 1.5 Hertz of EEG activity in the delta range. And you can see in the spectrum an intermediate power. And so with this spectrum, you can summarize the frequency contents of resting state EEG activity. And previous studies have shown that you can obtain reliable EEG biomarkers during resting state eyes closed. And you can see some studies recording the resting state EEG in 2 periods of 5 minutes in the same subjects, and obtaining a very high correlation of alpha power 0.9. And if you record in a healthy subject after 4 weeks, you can obtain a very high correlation between alpha power in resting state EEG, eyes closed, after 4 weeks, 0.85. And even after 14 weeks, in 2 recordings, you can obtain very, very reliable EEG power measures in healthy subjects. And this is really useful to have a robust EEG biomarker for clinical applications. But of course, you are interested in what's happening in the cerebral cortex rather than scalp surface. And you can obtain some approximative estimations of the cortical sources of resting state EEG using several software platforms. One very popular, and my group use frequently this platform, is Iloreta platform, which is open access, and you can download the software and repeat our results. And we use artifact-free periods of resting state EEG in eyes closed, typically, and use as an input for Iloreta software. And we can obtain cortical sources in regions of interest. We use large regions of interest because we use clinical electrode montage, 10-20 system with 19 scalp electrodes. The traditional 10-20 system today is updated to 25 electrodes. In a European project called Pharmacog, we tested resting state EEG biomarkers in Alzheimer's disease patients. And we related these resting state EEG biomarkers with the measures of cerebrospinal fluid, the diagnostic biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease in cerebrospinal fluid, or positron emission tomography using radioactive sugar, or the brain atrophy as measured by structural magnetic resonance imaging to validate EEG biomarkers. And so you can see the typical results in the cortical sources, iloreta cortical sources of resting state, eyes closed EEG. And you see here in the vertical axis, the cortical source activation. In the horizontal axis, the frequency bands, and the cortical regions of interest in the boxes. And we compared the resting state cortical sources in a population of Alzheimer's disease patients with mild cognitive impairment, a prodromal stage of dementia, before dementia, in the time progression of the disease. The subject has objective cognitive deficits, including memory in this case, but with a reasonable independence in the activities of daily living, mild cognitive impairment. And we compare the EEG source activity with a population of patients with mild cognitive impairment not due to Alzheimer's disease on the basis of cerebrospinal fluid biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. And you can see in blue the non-Alzheimer's disease MCI patients having a clear peak of cortical activation in alpha in occipital region and parietal regions, the higher cortical source activation in alpha RIMS, and a clear decrease in the red group of Alzheimer's disease with mild cognitive impairment. So we could demonstrate that even if you have the same cognitive deficit level, the two groups, one Alzheimer's disease, the other non-Alzheimer's disease, show a different cortical source pattern in the resting state EEG. In Alzheimer's disease patients with MCI showed also an increase in delta cortical source activity in the temporal and the frontal areas. So delta and alpha could distinguish the two groups of mild cognitive impairment patients, one Alzheimer's disease, the other non-Alzheimer's disease. Another study compared the cortical sources of resting state EEG in Alzheimer's disease patients having greater impairment in the ascending cholinergic systems from basal forebrain to cerebral cortex. You can see in red and yellow the trajectories of these cholinergic pathways, and compared two groups of patients with mild cognitive impairment. One group had more cholinergic impairment in the tracts, and the other group have the same cognitive deficit, but with less impairment in the cholinergic pathways as revealed by magnetic resonance imaging. And the reference group was in the normal healthy subjects. And you can see that in normal elderly subjects, you have the highest cortical source activity, and in a clear drop in alpha source activity in mild cognitive impairment with less cholinergic tract deficits, impairments, and the more drop of alpha source activity in patients with more impairment in the cholinergic trajectories, pathways to cerebral cortex. So alpha RIMS was sensitive to impairment of cholinergic projection to cerebral cortex, which is typically related to Alzheimer's disease, even in the prodromal stage of dementia. Another validation was the relation to hypometabolism in the brain as revealed by positron emission tomography using radioactive glucose binding the neurons when they're active. And you can see that in this specific case, we use a global delta source activity And we investigated the correlation with the indexes of brain hypometabolism as revealed by positron emission tomography. And you see that the higher the indexes of hypometabolism, pulse index of PET, and the higher the pathological global delta source activity. And the same was true for two independent indexes of hypometabolism by PET, pulse and HCI. So this was a demonstration that EEG abnormalities in delta rhythms are related to some hypometabolism in the cerebral cortex as revealed by PET. Another correlation was obtained with the normalized gray matter volume of the cerebral cortex. And in this case, you see here a group of Alzheimer's disease patients and normal subjects. And we obtain EEG recordings in the resting state, the computation of a global delta source activity in the upper graph, and alpha source activity global in the model of the cerebral cortex in the lower graph. And you see that the higher the delta source activity and the lower the volume of the cerebral cortex. So delta is related to atrophy in the cerebral cortex. And the same is true with alpha. The higher the alpha, which is a healthy sign of cortical synchronization, and the higher the normalized gray matter volume of the cerebral cortex. So another demonstration that we have some relationship with cortical neurodegeneration in old people. And we confirmed this result with another study using another measure, not the volume, but the gray matter density. And we could obtain a clear, significant correlation in Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment in red, and normal healthy subjects in blue, between the occipital alpha source activity in the vertical axis and the occipital gray matter density. The higher the occipital alpha source activity, the higher the gray matter density in occipital lobe. And we could obtain also a correlation with the global cognitive status revealed by mini mental state evaluation and occipital alpha source activity in the resting state. Another step was the comparison with patients with dementia or cognitive deficits, not due to Alzheimer's disease, and specifically cerebrovascular disease or Lewy body diseases. And so in one study, we could compare at the group level, the cortical sources of resting state eyes closed EEG in normal elderly subjects with the maximum in the posterior areas of the cerebral cortex in the model of Loretta, nose up, and a clear drop in patients with mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. You see the pink color, the reduction of alpha source activity. And in patients with dementia due to cerebrovascular disease, diffuse vascular lesion in the white subcortical matter. And you can see that you don't see this drop of alpha source activity, but an increase in theta band from 4 to 8 Hz when compared to Alzheimer's disease and normal elderly subject. So a different profile at the group level, showing that EEG is sensitive of different neuroanatomy, neurobiology, neurophysiological features of cerebrovascular disease with dementia and Alzheimer's disease with dementia. And we could observe also differences in normal elderly subjects in blue Alzheimer's disease with dementia in red, dementia due to Parkinson's disease, dementia due to Lewy body disease with different colors, these groups. Very similar level of dementia, mild to moderate in Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Lewy body disease. You see in the vertical axis cortical source activity, and in the horizontal the frequency bands and the regions in the Loretta model of the cerebral cortex. And you can see the maximum resting state eyes closed source activities is in alpha in normal elderly subjects in blue, with a dramatic drop in red in Alzheimer's disease with dementia, and the intermediate values in Parkinson's disease and Lewy body disease with dementia. So the same clinical manifestation of severe cognitive deficits and disabilities in the activity of daily living, but different profiles of cortical source activity in alpha RINs, but also in delta RINs. For example, in delta RINs, the greatest abnormalities were in delta in Parkinson's disease with dementia when compared to normal elderly subjects and Alzheimer's disease with dementia. And a very similar pattern was observed in my cognitive impairment subjects. And you see that the maximum source activity in blue in normal elderly subjects, a clear drop in Alzheimer's disease in my cognitive impairment, and intermediate level in Lewy body with my cognitive impairment in green, and the higher delta source activity in parietal and temporal and frontal areas in Lewy body with my cognitive impairment when compared to Alzheimer's and the normal elderly subjects. So similar to dementia with less abnormality. And the same was true when we compare normal elderly subjects, Alzheimer's disease with my cognitive impairment and Parkinson's disease with my cognitive impairment. Again, the maximum drop of alpha source activity in the posterior areas in the Alzheimer's disease with my cognitive impairment, intermediate level in the Parkinson's disease with my cognitive impairment, and the higher delta in Parkinson's disease. Another important point to follow the disease over time, because it's progressive and there is some clinical deficit increasing over time, is the ability of EEG biomarkers to reflect this disease progression. And we could demonstrate in Alzheimer's disease with dementia that when you compare two recordings, the first recording in baseline and the follow-up 1 year EEG recordings, and you compute cortical source activity, you can see that in red, in the second recording after 1 year, you have a decrease, a global decrease of alpha source activity, and also an increase in delta source activity in the second recording in Alzheimer's disease with dementia. So there is sensitivity to progression of the disease in 1 year in Alzheimer's disease with dementia, but also when the Alzheimer's disease patients have my cognitive impairment. You see that in the second recording in red, there is a clear decrease of alpha RINs in the parietal, occipital, temporal areas in the same Alzheimer's disease MCI patients after 1 year in red. And in another study, we could compare the data in MCI people with Alzheimer's disease in red with the MCI people due to another disease in green. And you see the recordings after 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months. And you can see that there is an abnormal increase in delta source activity globally in the cortical model over time in Alzheimer's disease with MCI compared to MCI not due to Alzheimer's disease, which were more stable over time. Now we are going to the end of the presentation with the response to the typical symptomatic cholinergic therapy that we give to Alzheimer's disease patients. This cholinergic therapy increases the cholinergic neurotransmission and improves some attention and memory in the patients for some months, 1 year maybe, in 50%, 60% of patients. So it's not a strong therapy and improve for relatively short period attention and memory in these patients when they responded to therapy. And so we compared in Alzheimer's disease patients with dementia the response to the therapy after 1 year of cholinergic therapy. So you can see here two groups of Alzheimer's disease patients with dementia. In blue, the people who have some beneficial effect in the cognition after 1 year of the therapy, responders, against non-responders, not showing this kind of improvement in cognition. Here you can see the difference between the first recording and the second recording after 1 year. And the 0 means that you have no changes in the cortical source activity after 1 year. If you see negative values down in the down part of the graph, means that after 1 year you have less cortical source activation. And this was the case of alpha frequency in the cortical source activity, resting state, eyes closed. There was a clear drop of sources of alpha rhythms in alpha frequencies after 1 year of the therapy. And this drop was greater in patients not responding from a cognitive point of view to 1 year of therapy or cholinergic therapy, but was clearly evident also in the responders, showing that you have some beneficial effect, do some improvement in the neurotransmission, but there is no stop of the disease. And you see a decrease of alpha source activity after 1 year, even in the responders. So we can conclude that in the spectrum from Alzheimer's disease neuropathology to Parkinson's disease neuropathology, you have a different weight of amyloid accumulation in Alzheimer's disease compared to Parkinson, and the increase in alpha-synuclein neuropathology in Parkinson's disease when compared to Alzheimer's disease. And in the Lewy body disease, you have halfway neuropathology. In most cases, you have also some amyloid neuropathology in a Lewy body disease. And you see that we have different genetic risks of the diseases. For example, ApoE in the sporadic Alzheimer's disease, GBA in Parkinson's disease, or SNCA in Parkinson, but not Alzheimer's. And we could see that there is also a clear different pattern of resting state cortical sources of EEG. You have a less alpha source activity in Alzheimer's disease when compared to Parkinson, and the highest abnormal delta source activity in Parkinson compared to Alzheimer's, and Lewy body disease halfway. So we can conclude that EEG biomarkers can provide a very specific angle of a neurophysiological oscillatory mechanism underpinning the maintenance of vigilance in quiet wakefulness, something that it's important for the quality of life, because patients have a problem to following a TV program or to maintain a conversation in the social interactions due to this drop of vigilance reflected by changes in alpha rims. So we think that today we have data to fit the dream of Hansberger in this animation, which predicted the use of EEG for patients with mental disorders. Thanks for your attention. Okay, so now I am at your disposal to clarify some parts of my presentation if you want. So do not hesitate to write your questions in the chat and try to switch on your microphone. Meanwhile, I will stop the